Misha here, and well, we've kind of come to the end of the last roughly year. I've been going over my FAL collection, and because of that, I've actually added one or two that I've shown you. But now I've saved the best, or at least my most favorite, for last. You know me, you know where we're going. If nothing else, you see the title of this video. Today, we're going to talk about my collection of Argentine FMAP, FALs or FSLs for the semi-automatic version. And mine were all imported by Armscorp, although we will talk about a couple of other pre-ban importers and post-ban activity as well, as we kind of wrap up this revisit of the FAL. Hey, I rhymed. Alright, well, it's no old barn door or old wood crate, but here they are, all laid out. And now we're going to go through them. Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, even a Type 4 in a way. And share what you think about them. And let me know your favorite below, and I'll let you know mine in the end of the video. But before we kind of dig into those four, and even though I don't have an early Argentine FAL to show you, even in kit form, I do have something else that might suffice. But before that, if you could, please like, share, subscribe, especially as summer drags on. Really need all the support. Like to help us support us on Patreon. And also, if the video's a little different, I just picked up a new camera because the other one was getting a little worn out, and it was Prime Day deals. But I haven't really got all the settings done yet, so it's kind of on default. So apologies if anything's a little wonky. With that, let's dive in and go back to the 1940s, actually. You've seen it before, but it has been a little while. My Argentine SAFN, or FN49, the father of the FNFAL. But this is the Argentine Navy conversion version, and 7.62 NATO. It does take the detachable mags. Interesting variation here, and one I'm really happy to have. But it all starts off back when FN releases the FN49. They're really kind of targeting what we would think of as third world nations that don't have access to World War II surplus or just don't want it. And this is why the first couple of sales are to South America and, well, Egypt, but Venezuela, Colombia, and you have Argentina. They get a sample in 1948, 1949, and that's it for a little while. But then in July of 1953, the Argentine Navy orders a little over 5,500 of these, but not in this configuration, far from it. They had the traditional fixed 10-round mag, and they were in 7.65 by 53. But we think of a 7.65 by 53 Argentine today, but it actually started off with FN because it was an early Mauser cartridge for like the 1891, 1893, way back in the day, and even the Belgian 1889. The reason Argentina ended up with it, and their bolt actions, was because FN made them a heck of a deal because they had it. Long story short, and abbreviated, I know. So they were in that cartridge, and they were for the Navy. The order was delivered quite quickly, and this was right on the cusp of the FAL coming out. So by 1956, the FN49 is dormant. Now, I should mention, in 1960, Indonesia does place one more order. Essentially, they had made several samples for over 24 nations, but only 9 major contracts were issued by 8 nations, and Argentina was one of the last ones. By 1961, FN is no longer doing the FN49. The FAL's taken off. They've progressed into a couple of generations there. But the Navy had these, and they were still in good shape. Why not? But they're in an obsolescent caliber. So they actually start looking in the mid to late 60s about how to convert them. Now, FN has really nothing to do with this, and actually FMAP, Rosario, doesn't. It's actually another company, Metal, Centrico, whatever, that undertakes this project. They do a study, and in the early 70s they're converting the Navy's guns, and they pretty much do convert them all. The big deal is they pop in a new barrel, still has the Mauser style bayonet lug, and it is threaded, although just has a cap on it. Still has the adjustable short stroke gas piston system, tilting bolt, hardwood stock with the semi-pistol grip, Argentine leather sling. But they modified the trigger guard and some of the bolt parts to let it take a new 20 round 7.62 NATO, i.e. 308 mag. But for logistical reasons, it's not an FAL mag. It's actually its own mag. Here's another one. It does have a last round hold open. Notice it's quite different. That's to work with the existing receiver and stuff. Here's a standard metric FAL mag. Note, quite a bit shorter. That said, the standard FAL loading tool will work with these, so there's at least a little operability. And these mags only fit in this gun. And you'd think, well, they must be pretty hard to find, right? Not really, because they only fit this gun. These started being imported into America around 1995, and then there was another batch in the early 2000s. The bad thing about the first batch, they weren't CNR yet, so they had to be neutered because we're post-89 and we're actually in the early days of the federal assault weapons ban. The second batch, though, was allowed to still have the threaded barrel, the bayonet lug, and the detaching mag. And when they brought over the several thousand rifles, they brought over spare mags. So I think Centerfire Systems and others had extras with these for a long time. I ended up keeping 5 mags because I just have a standard kind of generic NATO pouch. They won't fit in an FAL pouch because, again, too wide, too big, and they really don't fit any of the other pouches, so I just kind of have like a generic one. But when I got the rifle, it actually came with like 10 or 12, and the mags are quite affordable for a long time, even if this version of the rifle is pretty rare in America. But ever since I learned about the FN49 30 years ago, I wanted this one. And it's actually after getting it that I eventually sold my 30-06. I had a Luxembourgian one. And I should just mention, they made over 175,000 FN49s. And of those, over 87,000 went to the Belgian Army and Association. And they're in 30-06, which is cool, as was the Luxembourgian. But we don't see them here because even though it was ridiculous with the 10-round mag, which was fixed, the Belgian guns had the provision that they could potentially, if the military wanted, be fitted for automatic fire. The ATF did not allow this. Therefore, the Belgian guns, not to mention the Belgian Congo order, are not able to be imported because ever since 1968, you cannot import guns that are full auto or made to be full auto if you move out parts for the civilian market. Basically, you can't do any, class 3 guns, SBRs, SBSs, even suppressors. So this is why a lot of things happen. So over half of the guns in the best caliber, maybe, aren't importable. That's why the handful of about 6,000, 6,500 Luxembourgian ones are so popular here. They're about the one way to get a 30-06. Now, the most of the FN49s you find are like the Egyptian 8mm, which I showed in a previous FAL video. There's over 37,000 of those, not to mention some that Century put together from parts kits. There's also the Venezuelan 7mm. They're out here. In fact, my very first FN49 was a Venezuelan. I just sold it because it was the only gun I had in 7mm at the time. Those are really cool, and that was the very first contract made in 1948. You do see a handful of the Colombian ones too, but I've actually not owned that one myself. This one does seem cool because it's in a NATO caliber, detaching mag, and between 1948 and 1953, FN made some product improvements. For example, the firing pin to the gun, and since these were delivered between late 1953 and 1954, they always had kind of the best product features. They have a kind of baked on enamel lacquer finish over phosphating. They're actually known for very good accuracy. In fact, the Navy would use these as kind of DMRs during the 1982 Falklands War, after which time they were finally retired after having served for a long time. But I just wanted to show this since I don't have the FAL M2, because none of them have ever been imported. We just have, parts kits builds, which I'm not against. It's just, I haven't run across one yet. So this is kind of a good representative of just a, early and fun gun. But with that, this is an FAL video, so let's get to talking FALs. Or not, tricked you. Now, I recently did a video on the FN Browning High Power, World War II, looking at the English and the German occupation ones, which I had a lot of fun making, but if you give it a view, that would really help. I think you'll find it interesting. But in that, people brought up the Argentine High Power. Like I said, FN and Argentina, the FMAP government factory, Rosario, DGFM, had a long-standing relationship since the Mauser days, obviously the FN-49 for the Navy, and they contracted to produce the high power 9mm, and they had a few updates and versions, but it's absolutely as good as the FN. So it's no really surprise when 1955 they're testing the up-to-date rifles of the era. In late that year, they select the FN FAL, and by 1958 they get their first FALs. These are 100% Belgian built. They're basically M2 versions. So early on could be wood, stock wood forearm. Soon they'll go to the early polymer forearm, and these will be lugged barrel guns with no flash hider, kind of like the Israeli. In fact, they'll still be issuing lugged barrel guns into the early 70s. But they knew for a fact they wanted to produce their own, and of course they're across an ocean, so it makes sense. FN quickly agrees to allow licensed production, even some limited distribution. So by 1960, they're already transitioning over to first building guns from FN parts and then learning how to make parts there. And unlike, say, Israel, Argentina absolutely makes receivers, not to mention barrels, lowers, furniture, all that stuff. And they end up making the pretty much entire FAL product line too, which is pretty interesting. A lot of nations did not. But yeah, if you'd like to see a video talking about Argentine pistols, including their version of the 1911, let me know. We can definitely make that happen. Maybe even get out and shoot the FAL 5000, or at least the Argentine interpolation of it. Yeah, after the M2 style, which they would ramp up production throughout the 60s, they would switch over to the Type 3 receiver. FN introduced the Type 3 in 1973 as a forged receiver, and then in 1977, FN went to an investment cast Type 3 because the extra meat on it, lack of lightning cuts, then it was fine. But Argentina, like Brazil and Bello, kept forging them. In fact, they always would. So that's one reason I really do like these. And then they would have, gone to the polymer buttstop before and what have you. Now this is an Armscorp pre-ban import. They were not the sole pre-ban importer. In fact, they probably weren't even the first. There's a little bit of debate, and there's a lot of unknown about this, guys. This is pre-internet, and even though there are records, things go. National Arms, though, were early importers to pre-89. What do we know about Armscorp? Well, they did a few different things. They seem to have been importing the guns between 87, 88. Straight factory-built guns. And the reason that FMAP was willing to do these, well, was the Falklands War. Up until 1982, they did not produce a semi-automatic version. This is the FSL. The select fire version was the FAL, same acronym as Belgium, but it's Spanish as opposed to French, basically. But they needed money, things going around, so they thought about doing this. Now, some sources say they were also doing them for police as a semi-auto. I can't confirm that. I just can say that it's a approved semi-auto. But it seems like the national guns came in a little earlier, 85, 86. The Bello guns, I don't know when. We do know that he, according to him, he brought over about 200. They seem to be of the standard 21-inch fixed stock version. And the national guns mostly seem to be the same as this, except for one difference we'll look at in a minute. And they might have also done a para, but it's a little up in the air. And on top of just importing guns, it gets a little more confusing because Armscorp brought over receivers or barreled actions, and they also brought over kits and assembled them on their own quote-unquote T-48 receivers. This is where you see the kind of M2 style. Now, if you see an Armscorp that has a gray phosphate finish, it's probably a U.S. assembled gun, even if it's Argentine parts. The factory guns, they'll have matching serials on the receiver, which is the upper, the lower frame, bolt, usually, but not always, and the barrel, right there. And they'll have a paint finish, carry handle, whatnot. I don't know if all of them had the bipod cut barrel, and this may not be an Argentine bipod, I'm not sure. The gun didn't come with when I picked it up. It was supposed to be Argentine, but it could be Belgian. The differences are minuscule. It is the quick detach style, though, which is kind of neat. And since it's pre-89 and all that nonsense, it was able to come over, taking the standard metric magazine, firing, of course, 7.62, carry handle, adjustable gas system. But for reasons, they made one... Ever since 68, the U.S. had a weird thing about grenade launchers, quote-unquote. So they made a special flash hider for these. It still works as a flash hider. It still has the notch down below to work even as a bayonet lug. But it doesn't have the cuts for a 22 mil grenade, and for whatever reason, it doesn't have the internal threading, probably because they just didn't see any reason to do it, to take a blank fire device. And these are usually blued versus being paint over phosphate like the rest of the guns, so they do kind of stand out. But it is correct for this gun, being a pre-ban. I just didn't want to mess with it, even if it's not mil-spec. Another thing I'm sure you've kind of noticed by now is we have an open-eared front sight. And that's because we have a original tall rear sight. We saw this on the Israeli, but typically by the 60s, most are going to the G1 STG 58 style, 3mm shorter. Interestingly, Argentina just didn't, at least not all the time. Everything else is very standard though, but it kind of makes these stand out as unique. The reason I like it over the Belgium is the Belgian imports, most of them, at least 98%, are on a cast Type 3 receiver. Nothing wrong with it, but when you could get a forged Type 3 from Argentina or Brazil, and they're cheaper, at least they were back in the day, why wouldn't you? Now, why do I like this over Brazil? I think it's the finish on the furniture. It's got this more matte texture finish versus the more glossy finish, and I just like it more. Personal taste. And I do think the tall sights are kind of unique. And these were a little bit rarer, at least less known. But that said, fewer than 1,000 came over from Armscorp. Typically, it seems like the pre-ban serials run from 1 up to 900 or so. Maybe a little more, a little less. Again, Bello, a couple of hundred. National, probably about the same. Serials are really confusing, though. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they start over. It's been a very fun gun, and this is the first one I picked up. And the only thing that was kind of not right about it when I got it was the top cover was wrong. I think what had happened, someone had a scope top cover on it, and then when they sold it, they took it off and just they threw on a whatever. But a friend sent me a proper one, and since it's not a serialized part, oh well. Close to what Argentina went to war with in 1982 in the Falklands, and just a good representative of a late style FAL. Next up, a gun I looked for several years, and if you've been around, you know what it is. My FMAP FAP. Originally, this was, the FALO in Belgium, the 5041 style, because it has the polymer stock. And I actually owned 2 pre-ban Belgians, and I really liked them. But there was one thing that bugged me about them. I'll mention it. I was already kind of collecting Argentine guns, and I think everyone's seen the photo of the Armscorp guns, the 4 of them. Yeah, on the crate, or barn door, whatever it is. I just thought it'd be neat to get this, and I've only seen a couple in my life. I think when I set out to find one, I didn't realize just how rare they were. This is a factory one. Quite a low 2-digit serial. I don't know how many they brought over of these. Some say 50, some say it's lower, 40, maybe even 30. I don't know, but I can't imagine these were great sellers. In fact, as I said, Armscorp only started bringing over complete imported guns around 87, 88. Then the ban came through in 89, so it's very likely they just had a small sample batch of a few dozen to see how they'd sell. Everything back here is the same as a regular gun. We do have this kind of early style wood reverse carry handle. Then we have the early style wood handguard that's short. The barrel is still 21 inches. It's just much heavier. In fact, as it is right here, this is easily a 11-pound plus gun. They did use the extended mags, although they had the same issues that the users of the Belgian guns had, where they'd have this weird failure at the second round on automatic, something that they never really fully overcame. Not many nations actually use the FALO. Israel's another big one. The British, well, the Argentine military used the FAP in the Falklands. The British actually had the L4A1, the converted Brannan 7.62. This has a pretty unique flash rider on it for the heavies. It is threaded for an internal device, which is kind of interesting that this one is and the first one isn't. And of course it has the notches for the bipod. I'm not going to clip this on. I'm a little limited on time, and you've seen these before. Helps if I do it the right way, but just open it up real quick. Got my blank fire device in there. This is a damn sturdy bipod. It's a girder. This is forged steel. It makes the Israeli one look flimsy, and it's not flimsy. Very, very similar to the Belgian, but I would say even beefier. And it's just held on by a C-clip retainer. It's pretty easy to put on and off, but yeah. I don't store it with it on. For one, sometimes your legs can bump up against your barrel assembly. And for another, it's just big and bulky for no reason. Again, screw and blank fire device. Kind of fun. And of course, these could use the standard magazine. I thought it'd be neat to get A, complete the collection, and B, because these were actually in service, you definitely see more of the Belgian FNH made 5041, 5042s in this country. But since it isn't capable of select fire, and it really doesn't give you any better accuracy, aside from just having a bipod out there. Of course, even the light barrel has a bipod option. I could definitely see how in the 80s there wasn't a huge market for this style of gun. And it's not just the FAL. Other beefy LMG type guns didn't sell as well either. But no, it's one of my favorite guns in the collection. And before we move on, what's the one thing that bugged me about the FN? It was on a Type 3 receiver, but every single one I've handled, it had a Type 2, Type 1 style lower, where this plate back here, this recoil plate, was cut back for the lightning cut. Not a big deal, but keep in mind, it sold for more than these did, so why pay more for a gun that has a feature that bugs you? Or if these are, Type 3. Another kind of odd thing about this one, though, it has the pretty matte texture buttstock, but it has a glossy pistol grip. And the couple I've seen of these, and so there's not many out there, they do. That's correct. Now, having the wood up front, wood carry handle, that's correct. Makes sense for a heavy. I think a polymer would be neat, but I like the exposed gas tube. It looks cool. Of course, no bayonet mount. So those are the two versions you really kind of identify with the Falklands. Obviously, many more of the standards came in, and I don't believe any other company imported the heavy. I don't think National or Bello did, but if you've got one marked to them, let me know. Argentina designated the standard version as the Type 1 or Mark 1 or just FAL 1. And the heavy, the FAP, was the Type 2, Mark 2, FAP 2. And the Type 3 is this here, the paratrooper, or at least the Argentinian variation of it. And it is a little bit different than the FN. It still has the retainer down here. And the stock, you gotta kind of squeeze it in and unfold. From early days, Argentina was interested in the para. The earliest paras, like the 5061, had the folding stock, but they had the 21-inch barrel. Then you had the 5062 from Belgium that had the 18-inch barrel. But to make them more commensurate with paratroopers, they went to the 5063 with a 17 and some change inch barrel. It's kind of a weird number. It's like 17.3 or 4. But that's just to get out the cargo door. And that's what this has. It has the 17 some odd change barrel, a little bit shorter than the 18. And this one does have a full-fledged flash rider on it, because this gun's actually from the Jack Freeze collection. He was the former owner-operator of Armscorp, and when he retired, he had everything, guns, receivers, parts, prototypes, samples, and he passed away about a decade ago, give or take. This is one of his guns, so it's a little bit different marked. And you'll notice, too, it has the closed ear front, and it has the so-called Holland rear sight. We recently looked at a Dutch FAL. Whereas some of your FNs just have a solid receiver here, this at least one has a donut, a filler in where a carry handle could go. It does have the folding charging handle. Typically your 61s still had a fixed one. And the receiver does have to be cut for it here. And the receiver has to be cut for the paratrooper recoil system top cover too, because whereas on your standard FAL it's back here in your stock, kind of like an AR. Obviously for this, they had to move it all in the upper. Actually very, very, very similar to what's seen on the FN49. We'll mount a bayonet to it, and you could even mount a bipod, but I wanted it to be light, so I didn't. Also, I put on a different sling. The Argentine leather slings are really cool and unique, but they are kind of heavy. And as I said, it's a similar style of stock to the FN, but it's a little bit different in construction. Doesn't have the hole in it, for one thing, for the extra sling mount. And the lower on this is actually a different type of lower. Now, FN did a aluminum lower. This one's kind of a type of cast steel. It's unique to this pattern. I don't know when FMAP started making the para. I know, like I said, the first ones came from Belgium, but these definitely came in the pre-ban era. It looks like National might have brought over a tiny number, maybe just a sample, and then Armscorp brought in more, but even at that very small number, estimates under 100. So maybe more than the heavy barrels, but then again, you can definitely see where this would be more attractive. Plus the FNs, even back in the day, did very well. The mag I put in it, just because, is one of the lightweight alloy FN type mags. Just seems appropriate for the para, don't you think? These are really cool. I remember looking at the whole para system when I got into FALs some odd years ago, and not knowing that it had to be mechanically very different, and wondering how moving the recoil spring up here and nesting it, because it's basically one big screen with two small springs with a spacer in between them, a guide. I was curious how that would change the recoil impulse, and we actually have fired this one, and then last year we did a video on the DSA replica FN Belgian 5063, and surprisingly they don't beat you up as much as you would think. But we don't really know how many of these came in, and it's really the only paratrooper available outside of the handful of M-Bells and the slightly larger number of Belgians. Most nations did not adopt the paratrooper, and if they did, very few actually licensed, manufactured them. They just bought the small numbers they needed, because how often do you need a folding stock 7.62 NATO gun? Yeah, especially outside of like Africa. But it's definitely probably the most kind of eye-catching, and I really do like this gun. But I'd be lying if I said it's my favorite. I'm weird like that. Is our final one my favorite? Maybe. It's definitely unique, and we don't really know much about these. This is the so-called Congo FN FAL type. And you do see this made in Brazil as well as the Bush rifle. And you do see some FN guns with the shorter barrel over in Africa, although it's kind of jury's out on if they were cut down there or they were made that way from Belgium. I have seen one semi-automatic Belgian 18-incher in America, because that's basically the only difference with a Congo and a standard, is a 21 to an 18-inch barrel. So basically a para barrel, the original like 5062 barrel. But what's kind of neat about this one, it doesn't have the bipod cut, and it has the relatively early style non-bipod cut handguards with the large drain holes. These are kind of unique to Argentine manufacturer. Like I said at the beginning, Argentina kind of started doing its own thing, and that's one area. Also notice it has the closed ear front sight, and it has the simplified rear, but it's not the single peep windage only of the para, the Holland. It is the updated para with two position. Yeah, I don't know how many of these Armscorp imported. Also, some say maybe they brought over standard ones and they did them here. Hard to say. This is another one out of the Jack Freeze collection. In fact, when I picked it up, I had a choice between this one and one that had the tall sights. But I thought having the short sights would be neat. Now, this version, known as the Type 4, with the short front sight and the two-position rear, was actually made famous because years ago, Sarco had a lot of kits for a really good price. They had the barrel, the complete lower. They were even semi-automatic already lowers because they were guns. You just needed to add receiver and mix, and they were priced very well. They were one of the last good deals in FAL kits that had barrels. So this was the Type 4, one of the last versions, and it just seemed kind of appropriate for a Congo to kind of simplify the sides. And it also makes it that much more distinct from the standard. There's not an official 50-point blah blah designation for these that I've ever found. But it is a version you see, and I gotta admit, 18 inches is more than enough to stabilize 7.62 NATO. You really don't get a whole lot more out of 21, and it's a better balanced rifle. It really is. And you do save a little weight, not a whole lot. And I really do like this early handguard. I always thought this one would kind of be neat if it had a wood buttstock, but then again, wood stock with a Type 3 receiver would be a little wonky, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, this is a bit of an odd duck, maybe even a one-off out of Jack Freeze collection, and could have been one that was a sample. We don't know. Then there's the photo where we see a Congo style, but I never could have even found an import number, so it might have been something that was upcoming. If you own an Armscorp imported, marked, especially pre-band receiver, let me know, because there's a lot of mystery surrounding these. But, you know, all good things come to an end, and a lot of these stories are pretty brief because March of 1989, George Bush signs an executive order that is an effective ban on evil rifle imports. It's more nuanced than that, I know. It's not even exactly an executive, whatever, it's the same difference. So then we get into the post-ban era, 1990. It's kind of funny. On a lot of the forum posts, I've seen some people say, oh, it was 86 the ban, or 94, 95 the ban, which is Clinton. It's amazing how often it gets kind of skewed for other things. 94 was the national assault weapons ban domestically, which, you know, only lasted 10 years. The 89 ban, though, we're over 25 years later and still suffering from it. So these were not importable as such. But the FAL actually got off a lot easier than other guns. I already mentioned how the FN-49 with the detachable mag originally in 95 was somewhat lightly neutered. The FAL, okay, it couldn't have a pistol grip anymore, so you'd have to put on a butthole stock. But you were still okay to have a standard magwell. That was not an issue. Now, all your evil features, aside from your pistol grip, are here in your muzzle device. Your flash hider, grenade launcher, if such, bayonet notch. So, easy thing. Don't put it on. Put on a nut over the threads, or if you want, cut off the threads or whatever. Either way, it was easy enough to kind of put that back to rights in 1990 if you wanted to. Now, 94 in the U.S., and you couldn't do it for a while. You get that. And obviously, no foldy stocks, but most FALs didn't have folders anyway, so okay. Mags are still cool to be imported for a while. Metrics are everywhere, inches, so even if you were worried about the September 94 ban on mags past a certain date, finding not a problem. And there was one other little thing. You could bring over receivers, at least for a little while, because they were considered repair replacement parts. So there's a market in virgin FAL receivers. And really the Argentine FAL got away better than some. I should say, I think some of the earliest post-89 ban Argentine receivers actually came in by a century when they were building those L1A1 kits, British and Aussie, up in Canada on semi-automatic receivers. Now, I talked about the Brazilian version in the MBell video recently. That's mostly what they used, but early on, they did have some Argentine receivers. Not exactly sure how they bought them, got them, whatever, but some Century guns were on Argentine receivers. And some people just brought over Argentine receivers. I believe PAC, much as they had done with MBell did. Armscorp probably brought over some too after the post-ban era. Why not? But the probably famous ones are the so-called SAC Lada ones. And what was kind of cool about them, they basically had guns that were cotton customs or ready to go. And at that time, one way or the other, they got the okay to basically split them up. So you buy the receiver and the barrel as one chunk, and then from a different company, you would buy the lower and all that. The only downside was, even though you had all Argentine parts, the serials didn't match. They could have, but you know, what happened is early days on the bulletin boards and forums, guys would put up a list of the serials and they would do an exchange. But they were all new guns, all semi-automatic, and if you took some time, you could do that. But they would have this little mark in here, SAC Lada. That was for Southern Ammunition Corp in Lada, South Carolina. Lada, whatever. It's right in here in the magwell, so in a magazine you can't even see it. The only other way to tell is the serial number. Like I said, I don't have an exact cutoff date, but 1,000, maybe a little under, is pre-ban versus post-ban. Certainly if you've got an 11, 1200, it's a post-ban. Not that it matters, the quality is absolutely the same, and you know, you could even match the serials, and you know, who even cares if the serials don't match, frankly. It's not the end of the world if you're just looking for quality, and that's what most folks were back then. You know, these are shooters. You bought the FNs for collectors. You bought the MBELs and the FMAPs to shoot. And why not? This is actually where DSA kind of gets started too. In 93, they ended up with some of the Argentine receivers, and they sold around 1,000. Then in 94, they released another like 3,000. So a good chunk of the post-ban. I don't know how many came in. Numbers are kind of squishy, but 10,000 maybe in total, with the DSA having sold half-ish of them. And Global, they had the parts kits. So you'd order your barreled action, and then you'd order your parts kit from a different company, get them in, slap them together. This didn't last all that long, but for a couple of years, right after the 89 ban, people really didn't know what they could and couldn't do, and the government really didn't know either. It wasn't as simple as you think. But by 95, 96, 97, you're getting stripped receivers. But then at the end of 97 into the early part of 98, the Clinton administration adds to the Bush administration's EO, which basically added on to the 68 thing under the sporting clause, and they got rid of the whole like spare parts clause. They also made it where you couldn't import guns that could readily take a magazine over 10 rounds. But really what killed the receiver market was they said, hey, you're not using these to replace worn out receivers on existing pre-ban guns. You're building guns off of them. You caught us. I mean, to be fair, this receiver would probably last 70, 80, 100,000 rounds. So who has that kind of 308 money? But that plus the restriction, there's no good way. You know, like on an AK, you can just make a narrow mag well or change the bullet guide. There's just, because of the FAL receiver, it's just no really good way to do it. Plus, they don't know, even if they go to the trouble of altering the design, if the government won't pass new restrictions later on. The good news was, usually open imports that were already approved were allowed to run their course, so you still had receivers coming in from MBEL and even Argentina up until 2000, maybe 2001. It's hard to say when importation ended and when just companies sold off their stocks, because this is the federal assault weapons ban era. You know, building is not as fun as it would become after 2004. Plus, you had Gunin and DSA. This is still when LMT was making their receivers, making really good quality U.S. receivers. And if you wanted to go cheap, you could always get a Hess. It wouldn't blow you up like a Williams, so there is that, at least I can say for it. But those were the last Argentine FAL receivers, and then the parts kits would drop eventually. Several years later, like I said, Sarco had some of the last really good quality kits. And you could always get some of the M2 kits and build them up on whatever receivers. A lot of people will use a Type 3 just to keep it all Argentine. That kind of bugs me. It just looks weird to have a lugged barrel and a Type 3 receiver, says the blind guy. So, yeah, I'm probably wrong, but oh well. And the world kind of moved on as FALs dried up. But when I got my guns, the Argentines were actually just a little bit cheaper than Brazilian, and Brazilians were quite a bit cheaper than FNs. So I kind of stumbled into these because I thought that's a great quality, and people hadn't discovered them yet. I would say people started to really kind of notice them between 2010 and 2015 in that era. And luckily by that time I'd kind of picked up my 4 and didn't have to pay the exorbitant prices, because yeah, the things are getting a little woo-woo today. But they are good guns. At least you're paying for quality and not some piece of crap. And I would definitely shoot them. I'm a shooter. I actually look for guns that aren't in the box. And I don't mind. Like I said, this one had the wrong top cover. Sure, who cares? For the years, I have so many gaps in my knowledge of the import history of these. So if you know more, especially if you've got a gun or owned one at one time, please share in the comments below, because I'm always adding to my notes. I love accumulating data. With that, now it's time for me to ask you some questions. How many of you think I was crazy for selling some FN guns to get these? Or maybe you think that was okay, but I should have gone with MBEL. And I very well could have. I just kind of fell into these, and frankly, I found the options. Basically, I found this one. It's a pre-ban, but it was kind of marked like it was a post-ban because people really didn't know the difference back then. And then a friend hooked me up with these from the Drac Freeze collection. I actually did some trading. I think I traded a Valmet for this one, which back then Valmets weren't bringing what they are today, so it was a pretty fair trade. And then something else for the para that was pretty commensurate. And that left me just really needing a heavy. And that same friend actually introduced me to someone who had a heavy, and he kind of hemmed and hawed about selling it. But I'd only ever seen one before for sale, but it had been modified. It was missing its bipod, which isn't a huge deal, but it had a weird handguard. I think it was like a quad rail on it, like one of the newer DSAs. And then I met this one, and the gun was just a little bit of a scratch on the pistol grip. Maybe someone had a ring, but other than that, it's really good shape. And I've shot all of these. Not many times, because I've got other FALs for that, but yeah, I just kind of fell into them. I also really like my Israeli, and never really set out to have a lot of pre-ban FALs, but for a long time, as long as you weren't insisting on the Belgians, you could get a really good deal. But times do a change. Or maybe you think I'm just crazy for liking the FAL altogether and you're a G3 person. I can respect that. Or maybe you're an M14, M1A person, and I'm sorry. One day you'll see the light. But appreciate you hanging out today. Check out the previous videos if you have not. And help out on Patreon if you can. But if you can't, liking, sharing, subscribing, sharing with buddies. Yep, definitely just commenting really helps a lot. So we're going to wrap this up. Kind of a balmy day out here. And I've got some plans in the works. So we'll get back to shooting very, very soon. This is Misha. Peanut and I will catch you very soon next time.